In World War II stories, many consider Joseph Stalin as an evil dictator. Stalin was a monster, perhaps the most ruthless tyrant of the 20th century. But in some parts, he was known as a hero who saved his people. Without Stalin, there would be no modern Russia. From both perspectives, Stalin was both a builder and a destroyer, the man who saved his country and doomed millions of lives in the process. Stalin is both a hero and an evil. Stalin is a cold, quiet person who is a highly intelligent and paranoid in politics. He's manipulative and charming when needed. He was extremely secretive. He rarely reveals his true feelings. But he also likes to make dark jokes. If only one man dies of hunger, that is a tragedy. If millions die, that's only statistics. When he lost his first wife, he lost the last human part of him. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity. What is Stalin's real story? And is Joseph Stalin an evil dictator? Stalin was born in Guri, Georgia, in 1878. His mother, Kutateladze, dreamed that her son would become a priest. You could have been a priest. She called him Soso. Even as a dictator, he sometimes wrote her letters, signed Your Soso, but he also kept emotional distance. But his father, the Vissarion Jugashvili, is a cobbler and alcoholic, often unstable and abusive. My father beat me. I learned to hold my tongue. His violence drove Keki and Soso away. They fled when Stalin was so young that he didn't remember his face, but couldn't forget the fear. In Tiflis, life became hard. Kiki got a job as a laundress and seamstress. They lived in tiny rented rooms. In 1894, Stalin, at the age of 15, received a scholarship to study at the Tiflis Orthodox Seminary, but in that school, students were forbidden to read non-religious books. But on secret, Stalin discovered Lenin through underground networks. By 1896, he was organizing student discussion groups about socialism and workers' rights. In 1899, he was expelled. That day, his mother's dream of a priest died. After leaving the seminary, Stalin worked at the Meteorological Observatory as a clerk, but his real passion was organizing secret worker meetings at night. Meteorological by day, Marxist by night. His underground identity name was Koba, not this Koba. Koba, the Georgian folk hero who fought against injustice, similar to Robin Hood. Koba does not forget his friends or forgive his enemies. Around 1901, Stalin joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, the main Marxist movement opposing Tsar. In 1902, he organized a secret labor strike among railway and factory workers. He was arrested by the Okhrana, Tsar's secret police. He spent 1 year in prison and was exiled to Siberia. In 1903, Lenin's party split into two, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Stalin chose Lenin's side, that values discipline and obedience, the same qualities he'd learned in the seminary. In 1906, Stalin married Kato Svenidze. Her brother was one of Stalin's comrades. That's how they met. A year later, she gave birth to their only child, Yakov. Only months after Yakov's birth, Kato fell ill with typhus and died at just 22 years old. When the news reached Stalin, he was completely shattered. This creature softened my heart of stone. She died, and with her died my last warm feelings for humanity. Stalin loved her deeply. It's said that only she saw the real Stalin beneath his cold, harsh heart. Stalin hated Yakov. Stalin's hatred of Yakov is connected to Stalin's feelings about softness and kindness, which goes back to Stalin's relationship with his wife. He lived as a living reminder of Cato. Yakov's resemblance to his mother and his innocence only deepened Stalin's bitterness. Shortly after the funeral, he left Tiflis and went underground to organize strikes, and later planned the Tiflis bank robbery. The robbery was to fund the revolution, where Bolsheviks stole 341,000 rubles by throwing bombs into carriages. Dozens died, but Stalin's name remained hidden. And again, in 1908, he was arrested in Baku and exiled to Solvitchegorsk. He escaped in 1909 and went back to Baku. He was arrested once more, but released due to a lack of proof. These short arrests build his reputation. Shadow revolutionary who is hard to catch and impossible to break. But in 1912, he was exiled to Siberia. The authorities sent him to Nerem, deep in the forest, but escaped months later. Siberia taught him the habit of secrecy, suspicion, and survival. By 1912, he had risen in the Bolshevik ranks and began calling himself Stalin, Man of Steel. Soon after gaining prominence, Stalin was arrested again and sent to Turkhansk, one of the coldest and most isolated parts of Siberia. He remained there for 3 years, reading endlessly, "There is no fortress that the Bolsheviks cannot storm." He learned patience and control, traits that became his trademarks. Local remembered him as calm, distant, already steel in nature, not just in name. In 1917, Tsar Nicholas was overthrown, which ended Stalin's exile. He returned to St. Petersburg and became editor of Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper. When Lenin returned from exile in April, he sided with him. During the October Revolution, Stalin organized propaganda using his position as editor of Pravda to spread Lenin's calls for all power to the Soviets. He ensured that workers, soldiers, and sailors across Petrograd received the party's revolutionary message, coordinated printing of Lenin's decrees, and kept Pravda running, even when authorities tried to shut it down. After the Bolsheviks seized power, Lenin rewarded him with a government post, People's Commissar for Nationalities. As Russia descended into civil war, Stalin proved himself as a tough commander. He supervised the defense of Tsaritsyn. He showed no mercy to deserters. He earned a reputation as a ruthless enforcer, feared by both enemies and comrades. Shoot them like partridges. At the end, he was one of the top Bolshevik leaders. In 1922, Lenin appointed Stalin as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a job meant to handle paperwork and internal organization. But Stalin used it brilliantly. He controlled appointments, promotions, and party records. Quietly, he built a vast network of loyalty inside the party, people who owed their jobs to him. When Lenin fell seriously ill soon after, Stalin began taking real power behind the scenes. In Lenin's final moment, he warned the party about Stalin. "Comrade, Stalin is too rude, and I am not sure he can use power with sufficient caution." In 1924, Lenin died. Stalin immediately began to present himself as Lenin's heir. He organized Lenin's funeral, gave the main speech, positioned himself as disciple of Lenin. When Lenin died in 1924, no single leader was meant to replace him. The Communist Party was supposed to rule collectively through the Politburo, but in practice, everyone knew one man would eventually dominate. The key rivals were Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Grigory, and Lev. While Trotsky and others focused on ideology and speeches, Stalin focused on organization. As General Secretary, he controlled party membership, promotions, and conference delegations. That meant he could pack every meeting with people loyal to him. The newcomers admired Stalin's simple, loyal image. "We are all pupils of Lenin, and I am his faithful disciple." Meanwhile, Trotsky, who missed Lenin's funeral, looked cold and disrespectful. Trotsky was Lenin's most famous follower, but he had a fatal flaw: arrogance. He underestimated Stalin. He called him the party's clerk. He's just a bureaucrat, a pencil pusher, not a thinker or a revolutionary. This made it easy for Stalin to unite the others against him. Together, they accused Trotsky of factionalism, going against party unity. Stalin used party meetings and Pravda editorials to paint Trotsky as too ambitious, not a true Bolshevik. By the end of 1925, Trotsky had been removed as Commissar of War. After Trotsky's fall, Grigory and Lev thought they were using Stalin to weaken Trotsky. But Stalin quietly built his own base inside the party and expanded his network of loyalists in every regional committee. By the end of 1925, Grigory and Lev had served their purpose and would be Stalin's next victims. In 1926, Trotsky, Grigory, and Lev, former enemies, joined forces to form what became known as the United Opposition. They accused Stalin of betraying Lenin's ideals, creating bureaucracy, and abandoning world revolution. They called for inner-party democracy and criticism of leadership, but Stalin had already filled the party with loyalists through his general secretary role. He accused them of factionalism, violating Lenin's rule that the party must stay united and obey its central committee. By November 1927, they were expelled from the Communist Party. Grigory and Lev apologized and were allowed back, but Trotsky was expelled from the USSR. With the left gone, Stalin's last rivals were on the right, led by Nikolai Bukharin, who supported the new economic policy. Stalin used to support the NEP, but by 1928 he switched positions. He now called for rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture, arguing that the USSR must catch up with the West. Bukharin disagreed, warning that such policies would destroy peasants and cause famine. But Stalin accused Bukharin of being soft on capitalism. Bukharin's group is soft on capitalism. They don't believe socialism can win on its own. They want to compromise with the kulaks and private traders. That is not Leninism, that is surrender. He used his control over the party machine to pack meetings with his supporters. At the July 1928 Central Committee, Bukharin was outvoted. By 1929, Stalin had removed Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky from the Politburo. With both left and right factions crushed, Stalin stands alone at the top. In December 1929, on his 50th birthday, official celebrations hailed him as the great leader and teacher of the Communist Party and the Soviet people. After defeating the right opposition from 1928 to 1929, Stalin was free to impose his vision for the USSR. We are behind the advanced countries. We must make up this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or they crush us. He saw rapid industrialization as the only way to secure the Soviet Union from foreign enemies and make it a modern socialist state. In late 1928, the first five-year plan was launched. Millions of peasants resisted by burning crops and killing livestock. Millions starved, mainly in Ukraine and southern Russia. About 4 to 7 million people lost their lives, but Stalin called it anti-Soviet propaganda. After the first five-year plan, he launched the second five-year plan that focused on industry, transport, and defense. Propaganda starts to glorify workers as heroes. Stalin's image became omnipresent. People began to accept that he is the true disciple. In December 1934, Stalin orchestrated his infamous Stalin's Purge. On December 1st, on a cold afternoon in Leningrad, Sergei Kirov, a rising star of the Communist Party, had just finished a meeting. As he walked down the hallway, an assassin stepped from the doorway and fired a single shot into Kirov's neck. When the news reached Moscow, Joseph Stalin's reaction was cold and controlled. He immediately called for an investigation. Within hours, Stalin claimed it was a terrorist plot by hidden enemies of the party. In truth, no one knows whether Stalin himself ordered the murder, but he used it, and that's where the terror began. At his funeral, Stalin delivered a message. "Comrades, we have let our enemies hide among us. They must be unmasked and destroyed." It was a perfect excuse. We must smash and eliminate the agents of the Trotskyist, Bukharinist gang, who have wormed their way into all organizations, into the Red Army, into the economic and administrative apparatus, into the party itself. In early 1935, the first wave of arrests began. Hundreds of old revolutionaries and local party officials were taken by the secret police. By 1936, the trials began. In a packed courtroom in Moscow, the accused sat under bright lights, Grigory and Lev, two men who had fought beside Lenin. They admitted to absurd crimes, plotting with Hitler, sabotaging factories, poisoning food supplies. The judge read the verdict: death by shooting. It was theatre, but deadly theatre. The NKVD moved with machine-like precision. Night after night, a black car would stop outside your apartment buildings, and men in leather coats knocked on your doors. Get dressed, and bring your passport with you. By mid-1937, the Purge reached the Red Army. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and thousands of officers were accused of plotting with Germany and executed just 2 years before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. By 1938, Soviet society lived in complete terror. People stopped speaking their minds, even at home. Children were taught to report suspicious talk, even from their parents. And Stalin? He stayed silent in public, rarely mentioning the Purge directly. The class struggle is not weakening, it is growing sharper. The more successes we achieve, the more desperate our enemies become. Between 1936 and 1938, About 1.5 million people were executed, and millions more sent to the Gulag labor camps. When the Purge ended, fear had become a way of life. "No man, no problem," Stalin once said. The Great Purge made sure of that. In 1939, Stalin's purge had ended. His prisons were full. The party was silent, and fear ruled every home. But outside his borders, another dictator was rising fast: Adolf Hitler. Stalin didn't trust the West. He then signed a deal with his worst ideological enemy, Nazi Germany. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west and Soviet troops from the east, and the world held its breath to see how the world would fall. In 1940, Stalin occupied the Baltic states, annexed Bessarabia, and waged a disastrous war with Finland, the Winter War. The Red Army's performance exposed the terrible effects of Stalin's purges, and Hitler watched closely. At the same time, Stalin still believed Hitler would respect their pact. But beneath the surface, the two dictators were on a collision course. At dawn, June 22, 1941, without warning, 3 million Nazi soldiers knock on the door of Stalin. Operation Barbarossa had begun. Stalin was shocked. German tanks crushed Soviet forces. Kiev, Smolensk, and Minsk fell quickly. By October, Nazi armies were approaching Moscow itself, but something changed. The man who ruled by fear became the man who commanded a nation to fight. He went on the radio and spoke to the Soviet people, "Comrades, brothers, and sisters. Our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." It was the first time he had ever called his people brothers and sisters. When the war reached Stalingrad, the battle raged house to house. Stalin ordered not one step back. He issued Order 227, threatening execution for any soldier who retreated. The fighting was brutal beyond imagination, with over 2 million casualties. At the end, when the German Sixth Army surrendered, the tide of war turned. By 1944, the Soviets were on the offensive. They liberated Leningrad, recaptured Kiev, and were on the march to Berlin. At home, Stalin's image became godlike. Father of the peoples and genius of victory. Critics had vanished. Meanwhile, he met with Western leaders at the Tehran and Yalta conferences, sitting beside Roosevelt and Churchill as an equal. The man who had once been isolated in Siberia was now one of the big three who had shaped the post-war world. On May 9, 1945, Nazi Germany was defeated. Soviet troops raised the red flag over Berlin. This war cost the USSR over 27 million people, but emerged victorious. Moscow erupted in fireworks. Stalin stood on the Kremlin balcony, silent, watching the sky. He didn't smile. Victory had cost him everything but his power. In his toast, "I drink to the health of the Russian people, who bore the burden of this war, to the people who had faith in our government and our victory." When the war ended, Stalin's armies stayed in Eastern Europe. Soviet influence spread behind. Churchill later called it Iron Curtain. Stalin had won the war and half of Europe. But the terror that had begun in the 1930s never truly ended. Behind the medals and parades, the same fear ruled, and the man at the top, hardened by war and blood, became colder than ever. He had beaten Hitler, but he had become his mirror. When you think about it, it's true, he became what he defeated. He ruled the Eastern Front in terror. When the war ended, Soviet troops didn't retreat, they stayed, turning liberation into occupation, just like Hitler did once. When the war came to the Soviet Union in 1941, Yakov, Stalin's firstborn son from his first marriage to Kato, was already an officer in the army. He was quiet, disciplined, and deeply loyal. Yet, like millions, he was caught in the chaos of Hitler's invasion. Yakov lived his whole life without his father's Stalin. Stalin left him to be with Kato's family and never returned to raise him. But when he was 14, he was brought north to meet him. The reunion was heartbreaking. Stalin looked at the quiet, timid boy who spoke Russian poorly. "He's not my son. He's a stranger." For years, Stalin treated Yakov with contempt, mocking his accent, his sensitivity. He called him a weakling. When Yakov fell in love with a Jewish woman, when Stalin disapproved of their marriage, Yakov attempted suicide by shooting himself, but survived. But when the cold-hearted heard the news, he mocked him. he can't even shoot straight. Yakov reminds Stalin of his first wife. It's not fair or rational, but that's why Stalin hates Yakov and rejects him so brutally. Years later, in 1943, the Germans proposed a prisoner exchange. They would release Yakov if Stalin freed Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. Stalin refused the offer. "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant." Yakov was held at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin. He was beaten and tormented by Nazi guards. On April 14th, 1943, he ran towards the camp's electric fence and was shot dead. When Stalin was told of his son's death, he only waved his hand and walked away. As Europe built, Stalin built something else, an empire of control. His armies occupied Eastern Europe. Under Moscow's watch, a new communist government rose, obedient, silent, and loyal. Winston Churchill warned the world in 1946, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." Stalin dismissed it as warmongering. The world saw Stalin as the iron victor, the one who had crushed Hitler and saved Europe. But inside the Kremlin, Stalin had begun to see shadows again. He no longer trusted his generals, his ministers, or even his oldest friends. In 1948, Stalin's paranoia turned toward the Communist Party itself. At the same time, Stalin turned against intellectuals and scientists. He denounced cosmopolitans, a coded word for Jews and Western-educated thinkers. Beware the rootless cosmopolitan, an enemy with a foreign face. By 1949, the Cold War was heating up. The West formed NATO, and Stalin responded with his own alliances in Eastern Europe. But his fear wasn't of foreign armies, it was of the men sitting at his own table. He began holding midnight meetings, making ministers wait for hours, watching who looked nervous. A single raised eyebrow could destroy a life. Even Lavrenti Beria, his feared secret police chief, was afraid to make eye contact. At dinners, Stalin would pour drinks and joke cruelly. "You think I trust any of you? I don't even trust myself." By 1950, Joseph Stalin was 71 years old. Grey, slow-moving, and deeply suspicious. He rarely appeared in public. Instead, he spent his nights pacing his Kremlin office, or his dacha at Kuntsevo, a glass of wine in one hand and a list of names in the other. And the more isolated he became, the more those lists grew. Then came the first whisper, from deep inside the NKVD files. Doctors are killing the leaders of the party. The state newspaper Pravda published a headline, "Killer Doctors, Murderers in White Coats." It announced that a group of doctors had confessed to plot to poison Soviet leaders. The arrests spread rapidly. Hundreds of doctors, scientists, and intellectuals were detained, tortured, and forced to sign false confessions. By early 1953, Stalin had become a ghostly figure, still feared but increasingly incoherent. "They are all enemies. They will kill me like a dog." Everyone in his circle knew the old man was preparing one last purge, and it might start with them. Then, fate struck first. On March 1, 1953, Stalin collapsed at his Kuntsevo dacha after suffering a stroke. His guards found him lying on the floor the next morning, soaked in urine, unable to speak. For nearly 12 hours, they did nothing, too terrified to disturb the great leader without orders. When doctors were finally called, it was too late. Stalin died on March 5, 1953. The announcement shocked the world. Radio Moscow broke the news. Comrade Stalin has died from an illness of the heart and the brain. Millions poured into Moscow to see his body, displayed beside Lenin's in the Hall of Columns. His face was waxen, his moustache perfectly combed, his uniform glittering with medals. People wailed openly, some collapsing from exhaustion, others fainting in grief or fear. The crowd grew uncontrollable. In the crush of mourners, hundreds were trampled to death, crushed by the weight of their devotion. It was as if the sky itself was falling. The Soviet press called it a river of love for the great leader, but beneath the mourning there was relief. While the crowds wept, Stalin's old comrades began plotting behind closed doors. Within 3 months, one of them was arrested and executed that same year. But by 1956, Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech to the Communist Party. He exposed Stalin's crimes, the purges, the lies, the mass executions. He called Stalin a criminal who had abused power and betrayed Lenin's ideals. The world was stunned. Statues were torn down, cities renamed. His body, once resting beside Lenin, was removed from the mausoleum in 1961 and buried near the Kremlin wall. The man who had ruled a sixth of the planet was erased from the heart of his own revolution. Stalin's death left the country in ruins, powerful yet broken. A nation that both hated and loved him. A nation who couldn't decide whether to mourn or breathe again. When Stalin died, we cried, not because we loved him, but because we were scared to live without him. So, is Joseph Stalin a monster? He came from hardship, joined Lenin, and fell into despair after his first wife died. Years of exile in Siberia hardened him. As editor of Pravda, he used propaganda to crush rivals and rose to rule the Soviet Union. His 5-year plans modernized the USSR, but killed millions. After Kirov's assassination, he unleashed the Great Purge. He signed a pact with Hitler, entered World War II, and the war cost his own son and millions. After victory, he took control of Eastern Europe. In his final years, paranoia consumed him, even against loyal allies. When Stalin died, the Soviet people didn't know whether to mourn him or finally breathe. Stalin is a monster, a hateful, cold-hearted murderer like Hitler. But he is also a hero. He is the one who modernized Russia. Winston Churchill once called Stalin a man of granite. To Churchill, he was a great man, but a great barbarian, harsh but effective. If you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to join our Discord server. We hang out, share ideas, and you might even end up featured in future videos. Huge thanks to the artists, shout out to the research team, and a big thank you to our members for supporting the channel.